discussion today on machine learning derived FHIR resources. We're recording this call just because not everyone from the community who is interested in this topic was able to join in our scheduled session. So we'll share this back in the FHIR infrastructure chat so that folks who were part of some of the earlier discussions online will be able to catch up when they want to, and we'll just share this back with the community. So I wanted to start off with a couple of introductions around the room, and then we can dig into the topic at hand. But maybe just first folks can share just briefly who they are and what kind of stuff they work on and where. So I'm Josh Mandel. I'm a physician and software engineer. I've been pretty deeply involved in the FHIR standards development world over the course of the last 10 years or so. I'm the chief architect at Microsoft Health and for the Smart Health IT project. And if folks want to go around the room in what looks like Teams alphabetical order by name, that's starting with Bin Mao, if that works. Bin Mao, you're up.
Hi, this is Ben. I'm a data engineer in Boston Children's Hospital. I work with colleagues doing some machine learning stuff, but I'm not a machine learning expert per se.
Awesome, thanks, Ben. Next up, Danny.
Hi, I'm Danny. I'm from Microsoft. I'm the data scientist lead in Hadassah's team.
And then Donnie.
Hi, I'm Donnie. I'm a software engineering lead for Google Cloud's healthcare NLP.
Gino.
Hi, Gino Canessa. I work at Microsoft with Josh on standards and interop and lots of plumbing pieces and things like that. That's a lot of fun.
And then Guy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Guy. I'm a product manager at Microsoft Health and Life Sciences, focusing on basically creating different language understanding services for healthcare. Nice meeting you.
Thanks, Guy. And then Hadas.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hadas Bitran. I'm with Microsoft. And I'm with Health AI, driving a conversational AI and NLP products within Health and Life Sciences.
Awesome. And then Siti.
Hi, everyone. I'm Siti. I am part of AWS Health AI as well. And my focus primarily is on leading science as well as engineering for our natural language processing in medical domain. Yep.
Excellent. So this is a great critical mass. I was hoping to get a diverse experience from folks working in NLP and working with NLP for this conversation. And maybe just by way of background, I pasted a link to some kind of meeting notes doc in the chat here. I think that folks who joined after I pasted the link might not actually have the link. So let me just reshare it. So everybody's on the same page, and I'll also share my screen, but just an open invitation for everyone on the call. You've got access to edit this document as well as to read it. So if you want to add to my notes, fix, adjust, update the agenda with your own topics, please feel free to do that. That's why it's open and available for editing. Let me just hit the screen share button here again. But what I had laid out for the agenda on this call was to talk a little bit through some of the existing capabilities that folks have within their NLP and other kind of machine learning systems for deriving structured data from various source materials. And I thought it would be useful just to do a quick round the room for anybody who's building these kinds of pipelines. I won't call on people or define an order. I'll just let people raise their hands and share if they want to. But I thought that would help us just kind of set a baseline. I'll say on the way into this conversation, we had a couple of use cases for managing different FHIR resources and also elements of FHIR resources that could be derived from natural language text sources. And we've got a draft currently in the build version of the FHIR site that outlines, maybe the very simplest way to do just that amount of work. So let me see if there's folks who want to just, not raise their hands in the team sense, or you may, but just come off mute and talk about what kinds of capabilities you have or are interested in having for deriving structured data from other sources, and what kinds of inputs and outputs you think about, if there's ways today or approaches you have already that track provenance or expose this kind of history or linking information so consumers can see where things come from. I'd love to just hear overviews of kind of the state of the art in the experience of the folks on the line, and we can spend a little bit of time trying to understand these a little bit better.
Hey, Josh, I think I can jump in first.
Perfect, yeah.
Hi, this is Ben. We are actually currently doing similar job of converting an NLP result into a valid FHIR format. Definitely what's being proposed here is a valid situation where we need to specify the text starting point and either endpoint or the text span in the FHIR extension. But in our real use cases, we do find that it's best we have a clear identifier either in the extension or somewhere to indicate this resource has been generated by FHIR, not being input by the practitioner or any doctor in the hospital. So that's need to be a very clear differentiation between these two types of resource. And at the same time, we do find whatever engines being used in this NLP process will be critical to generate this resource, because different engines will have different result and different interpretation of the same text or the data, the span. I don't know if it's necessary to put it right here, but it's really good to have in case people want to replicate whatever has been generated here. Yeah, that's my initial thought.
Excellent. And Ben, just a follow-up question there. You mentioned some of the techniques that you're already taking and some of the provenance information that you want to track, like the engine that's used. Is that something that you are today encoding somehow in the FHIR resources that you create, or is that a future roadmap item for you?
Currently, we are putting it in the modify extension. Also, there is another thing we put into modify extension is polarity of the text. So it's like the negation of the text.
Excellent. And we'll come back to some of those modeling questions. I'm interested in the choice of modifier extension, but don't want to go too deep yet. So I think that's a really great overview. Do others want to share examples of what they're doing today and what kinds of capabilities they're already using in this domain?
I guess I can share a bit about what we're doing at Google. So currently we're not translating the results of our NLP into FHIR, and that's one of the things that, one of the reasons that I'd like to participate in this group right now. We are sort of extracting information from NLP. The provenance that we share right now is text spans, but we're sort of realizing that more detailed information is necessary if we want to enable use cases like like labeling or like actual provenance where you can assess where the data came from in terms of not just text spans but multiple text spans or bounding boxes on OCR data and things like that. So one of the things that we're interested in is sort of making sure that that the standards that we're building here are rich enough to encompass not just the things we're thinking of right now, but also things that we might not be thinking of, to make sure that we're sort of future friendly.
Awesome. And if I can just ask a quick follow-up in terms of the outputs of your NLP today, they're not FHIR, but can you say a little bit about the format or structures that you use to target the outputs?
Yeah, I mean, it's an API-based interface, so we're outputting JSON, and then JSON is just structured data. We basically came up with our own data structure that categorizes text spans according to the entity type, and then we sort of give meta information about each of the entities, including sort of like attributes, confidence scores, and things like that.
Cool. And for those outputs, for those JSON schemas, is there some separation between what I might call a clinical semantics and the things like confidence scores and annotations, or those things kind of coexist in a way that's sort of mingled?
They're kind of mingled right now. I think you sort of have to tease the information apart to understand what is a confidence score and what is an assessment of of clinical confidence, for example. So those two pieces of information are in the same data structure.
Yep. Cool. Okay. That makes perfect sense, and it's a very natural place to start. Others want to share overviews of what they're doing today, kind of state of the art or near-term roadmaps?
Yeah, I'll jump in a bit. I think we are at a very similar state as Donnie mentioned. They are at as well. I think a couple of thought processes we've going on right now is how can we think of deriving different document sections from unstructured text first, and see how can we link it with the FHIR format as well. So so we could try to see how deriving information that could belong to, let's say, family history or social determinants of health or different sections could automatically start filling in the gaps for FHIR where we have any. So that's just thinking we're going on right now to see, can we first determine the sections based on what information we get from our NLP today, and then and secondarily, how can we link it? But yeah, very similar place where you're at as well, Donnie. We keep our NLP and our FHIR or don't talk to each other today yet, but they will. Yeah.
And when you think about those documents and sections today, Siddhi, are you looking at representing each section with structured data in turn, or is the initial problem just actually getting the superstructure right, sort of the scaffold of those outputs?
Yeah, I think the initial idea is just to get the superstructure proper, and even to see how many superstructures can we identify via the unstructured test. Well, what are the important superstructures? Because there are so many. So which one do you prioritize, and how do you think of coverage when you prioritize? And I think one of the common themes we're noticing, and I would love to hear more later from everyone else as well, is coverage and accuracy go hand in hand here. Like, we can be highly accurate in a couple of domains or a couple of medical specialties, but not necessarily translate that to a larger corpus of all specialties. So we are constantly, with anything we do with either document section, we're always thinking of, we could get good at one kind of medical specialty or one kind of hospital system or one kind of templating, but are not able to move that along to generalize that further. So I think generalization to get to this space has been difficult.
Yeah, I bet that's a very common experience. All right, others who want to share what they've been working on, and I noticed, Dan, you joined, and thank you for adding yourself to the intros bullet list. Do you want to just introduce yourself briefly as well?
Sure. So my name's Dan Gottlieb. I think,
Dan, we've got a ton of background noise on your line, or at least coming through when you started talking.
Hang on, I suspect it's using the wrong mic.
Yeah, I suspect that too. It's just possible to make out what you're saying, but you switch mics, and we'll come back to you in a minute. Does someone from the Microsoft team want to talk about kind of current state?
Sure, I can say a few words. Share my camera as well. So basically, we're also looking for a way to kind of reference reference text that's FHIR resources and FHIR elements were derived from, especially when using NLP tools. The main focus would be really to kind of point into the relevant span, the relevant text span or spans. So it could be multiple as well, and kind of reference their index and length just for explainability and basically validation. So this is our main use case with this extension.
great. And that also gets me thinking about a conversation we can drive towards in a moment, which is, what are some of the goals of these extensions? And you mentioned a couple here: explainability, validation by customers or by users. And we can expand on that too as folks share some more of the goals. I think I heard maybe some more around traceability or kind of auditing later. All right, Dan, let's see if your mic is working now.
All right, is this clearer?
Much better.
Awesome. I have to get used to Teams after thousands of Zooms. So I was just saying, my name is Dan Gottlieb. I'm a clinical informaticist and software consultant. And my interest here is I've been working with Ben a little bit on the project at Boston Children's Hospital that's looking at kind of intermingling NLP-derived data with FHIR data that's coming out of EHRs in a structured format. And so wanting to be able to both kind of combine them in cohort definitions, but also understand which parts have a higher confidence level in terms of the quality of the data and which parts have a lower confidence level. And then as Ben said, because this is a research project, we're also experimenting with different NLP engines and different versions of those engines, and want to be able to track that in the resources and kind of filter on those aspects as well. So really interested in this discussion, and sorry I was a little late.
Excellent, welcome. Is there anyone else who's joined since we got started with introductions? Let me just open up the floor. All right. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so that I've got a better view on folks in the meeting, but everybody should have access to the document link at this point, and we'll share this document alongside the recording of this call when we're through. So anybody who wants to follow along will be able to do that. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to do was talk a little bit through goals, talk a little bit through some of the current definitions just as they stand in the FHIR draft today. But before we dive in there, let me just see if there's other agenda topics that folks want to add on to our list. Okay, so I'm going to mix up the order a little bit here and just briefly talk through the current FHIR definitions. So this will make more sense for folks who have the documents open. You can follow along under the current FHIR definition section. I think some folks have already seen these and been able to respond to them, but I just want to set a quick baseline. And thank you to Guy and the team who actually worked on getting these extension definitions put together in the FHIR build. It's still a fairly cumbersome process to contribute these kinds of updates into the FHIR core definitions. And sometimes it seems to take a little bit of guesswork because not all that process is super well documented. So it winds up being a bit of guess and check. But I wanted to just talk through what's there today. There's a link to this definition on the build.phir.org server, which has kind of the formal extension definitions. But I tend to find it's a little bit easier to reason from a couple examples just in terms of getting started here. So I just pasted a couple or tweaked a couple examples in this write-up. So the first example is in maybe what we could call the simplest possible scenario, where there is like one text block, which is the source of information that we're going to derive some FHIR resources from. And the first question is, how do you actually point to that text block if you want to say that, that this resource was derived from information in that text block? And what we're kind of assuming here at a baseline is that we can wrap up those kinds of text documents in FHIR document references. The good thing about that is it's a pretty general technique. You can wrap any kind of MIME type of attachment in a FHIR document reference. And so some of the benefits that we'll get from pointing to text in that form will apply to other kinds of documents as well, beyond just straight text. We could think about how to use this for image formatted scans of text pages as well, for example. And it's also worth pointing out that the extensions that we're going to look at here are defined in a way that they can be used at the resource level. And so to Ben's point, when Ben was talking about tracking resources that were derived from these algorithms, you could have a whole resource that's derived from the algorithm. And that's what we're going to look at first, like a condition that was derived from text. But these extensions are also defined so they could be used at the data element level. So you might have a condition that's already in your clinical history that is managed in a very conventional process by your primary care doctor who has noted that you have asthma. And that might be something that's manually curated and part of your problem list. And, in theory, a machine learning algorithm could help to populate information about the severity or the most recent attack or some of the triggers. That kind of element level information could be populated inside of a condition based on a machine learning algorithm. So these extensions can also apply at the element level, even if the entire resource itself was not derived from NLP. And I do want, feedback on that point. It's, I think, very interesting and intriguing from a modeling capability to have that level of granularity, but I don't know how realistic it would be for certain elements to be, derived on top of resources that are maintained elsewhere. Like there may be simplifications to that process, but that's the current definition. And the great thing about it is it's quite general. You can build a lot of different kinds of detailed provenance from that. So looking at this extension here in line 44 of the shared document, basically there's this top level extension, which is what's called a FHIR complex extension, which means it's going to have multiple parts to it, multiple data elements sitting inside. And in fact, this first example has 3 data elements sitting inside. One is called the reference, which tells us where to find that source document. It says, well, this is source document 123 on the server. And there's a couple of baked in assumptions that are documented right now in the extension definitions. If we just point to a document reference like this, the expectation is this is going to be a document reference that has exactly one attachment in it. And that attachment is the actual text source that we're talking about. The rest of the data fields in the document reference are metadata. What type of document was it? When was it created? Who was it created by? All that kind of standard stuff. But the actual derivation source is going to be the attachment. And we'll get onto a more detailed example in just a minute, but this is the simplest case. So we say that's where the text is. It's in that attachment. And then the other parts of this complex extension are just an offset. So where's the start of the span that was used to derive this information, and a length. So how far did that span go? And those are just both FHIR integers in terms of a simple data type. It's also worth saying that this reference itself is optional. So in some contexts, you might already sort of implicitly know what reference you're talking about or what document source we have in mind. So there's examples like you might have a custom FHIR operation, a standalone API where the contract is something like the client posts some free text to it, and then the API returns a bundle of derived resources. Doesn't store it in a server, doesn't manage it, just a purely stateless API that takes in document and returns a FHIR bundle. And if that's the sort of operating scenario, maybe you don't need to repeat this information about what text source every single derived field came from because they're all the same. So technically, we've left that as optional in the current model. And then I'm going to scroll down to line 64 to show you one more kind of advanced case. And I'll say this was something that came up during our FHIR infrastructure working group call. We proposed kind of this very simple model, and we had some feedback on that proposal even by the time we came to our first meeting in FHIR infrastructure work group. And one piece of feedback was, hey, there's not always going to be just a simple piece of text sitting in a document reference. Like, that's a great example of where the text might come from. But what if you've got something like a deeply structured FHIR document? So FHIR has data types like a composition, which I think Citi was referring to earlier, where you can have structured sections inside, and those sections can link out to their own data, but every section can also have its own narrative, which might just be represented as text. There's lots of places in the FHIR resources where free text could appear as part of a structured, like an overall structured resource. So the second example here shows what that might look like. Maybe you have a FHIR-based discharge summary, which is represented as a FHIR composition, and maybe it just has free text sections. This is actually a pretty common kind of scenario when translating from certain CDA documents into FHIR today, because the CDA documents have human readable or sort of XHTML sections. And the simplest thing to do with that is just translate it into FHIR, where each section from the CDA becomes one section in a FHIR composition. And you just take the XML from your CDA and you say, that's my narrative text. So what if that's what you had and you wanted to derive a condition from that? So the small tweak that you'll see here in this second example is, in addition to a reference to this FHIR composition, you can add an additional parameter called the path. And this is a FHIR path expression to a specific textual element within that resource. So if this condition was derived from the narrative from the fourth section of that document, you could say, section sub 3, because it's a 0-indexed FHIR path expression, .text. And you say, that's the source that we derive from. And then the rest of the extension works just the same way that it did in sort of the simple case above. So this is sort of the very first generalization that we had when we got into committee discussion, which was, let's have fewer implicit defaults. Let's have more flexibility for pulling out specific elements from inside these resources. And I call this out, number one, because I think this is really important. The more people you talk to, the more use cases you understand. Number two, because I think we want to be careful with the ways in which we introduce flexibility. The more flexibility you have, the more complicated it can be to parse and understand how these extensions work. But this is kind of the project that we have in the standards world is, how do we pick a good path that's going to satisfy most needs in a standard way. It's going to let people add their own additional semantics if they need them. And then sort of grow over time. So are there questions about the current state? I don't mean to represent this as a sort of complete or final solution. I just wanted to bring people up to speed with what is currently documented in the spec.
Can I ask a kind of a naive question? And
Please.
So just to understand, if you have like a document, like a record of a procedure, and you want to pull like the date for that procedure out of it, and then also maybe a procedure code, would you have a single extension on the resource with the document reference, and then could you put sub extensions on kind of each of those elements? Although date's a little messy because it would be a primitive. With the offsets, or are you thinking that like each extension would repeat kind of the document and then also have offsets for the specific data element?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a naive question at all. I think these are exactly the questions that we're going to want to grapple with as we get into the details here. Remind me, Dan, a FHIR procedure, is this a top-level resource type?
I believe so.
Okay, so I think, the answer here is, at least with the current proposal, there is some flexibility as to how this is modeled. So one thing you could say with this model is, we got this information from this certain document reference, this discharge summary. Let's get rid of this pathing, for example. And then you could go on to have your procedure date, whatever that would be. And then you could also have, the other example you gave was a code. That seems important.
Yeah.
Forgive me if I'm getting these fields wrong, but roughly speaking, this is probably a codable concept of some kind.
It is, yeah. I'm looking at, I just pulled that up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I see it's called occurrence state time would maybe be the simplest version of this.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And then the code itself is called code. Easily enough. So, that's one way you could say it. If you wanted to convey element level provenance, let's say this is our codable concept where we've got, text and a list of codings, and maybe we're, translating this into 3 different coding systems, which I won't bother writing down. So you could also add extensions here at the level of the coding to say, well, here's exactly why we picked these codes. And then you could repeat this whole extension structure inside to say, well, this particular code came from a different slice of text, or maybe a subslice of that text. And we got it from this string that happened, in an even more specific area. I think there's an open question about how important it would be to repeat this reference if it was the same as the reference from which the entire resource was derived. So we sort of leave open the possibility that this first part of the complex extension might not have to be repeated every time when there is clear context. So we leave open right now that kind of flexibility in the modeling choices to say, different products may see fit to populate more specific information at the element level. Others might want to just focus on the resource level, and you can mix and match. That's where we are right now. I'm not saying that's where we should land, but I just want to spell out where we have answers and where we don't.
Got it. Yeah, I like that. I think it might be worth having some specific guidance around the scenario where you have a bunch of different elements being pulled out of a single document, because that seems like, again, limited experience in NLP, but having just worked with NLP people a little bit on this, it seems like that's maybe a common scenario where you would have one record, but then be pulling out a couple pieces of data for your for a single or for one or more resources, and you might not want to repeat the document with each one. And as you pointed out, you might want to have kind of the span where everything is pulled from, and then the spans where individual fields are pulled from, or elements, I guess.
Yep.
So certainly would like some of the NLP folks to weigh in on kind of how, whether that makes sense and whether they kind of do element level spans.
Awesome. And Donnie's got a hand up, please.
Yeah, sure. So, so yeah, this is an interesting discussion. I wanted to circle back and tease out something, Josh, that you mentioned earlier as a potential use case. And that is to actually like add information directly into, into one of the, procedure, just sort of like additional annotation of things in the FHIR record. Like right now, there's sort of like two different levels of use cases, I think. If the first one is actually just capturing an NLP reference or inference, right? Like we took the text, we derived some piece of information, we're just representing that piece of information somehow. But then when you want to take that piece of information, you want to stick it in, into the record and say like, hey, this is the condition, this is, asthma, this is our evidence for it. You don't necessarily, it's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping where you say like, well, we think your asthma was severe because we saw the word severe one time, and here's where we saw that word. No, it's often like, okay, like over many records, like we have this evidence that it's severe, and and because of the confidence in there, and because it's repeated, and et cetera, this is why we're comfortable adding a severity marker to your condition, and this is why we think, this is the explainability piece. This is why we think that's true. So, in terms of inference, I can sort of, I'm kind of pushing for like multiple sources for inference as well, but I can sort of imagine, okay, one piece of text, one inference. But then when we're actually doing that second step to actually add information directly to say like, hey, all of our inference, we've sort of concluded this, it really needs to be many to one, because I don't think sort of having, in terms of provenance, like it needs to sort of be multiply derived in order to be useful. One follow-on thought is like, are these, two sides of the same coin? Like, do we think of any sort of inference as like, okay, here's an inference done with an NLP model. Here's like some pieces of text, date on multiple pages as evidence of a procedure date, et cetera. And then a second step, here's us inferring using some sort of analytics model or some other sort of downstream logic. This is how we took those inferences and put that into, into the condition resource, for example. Is that two types of the same sort of multi-level inference, or is that two different things that we want to separate? Here's an NLP inference. Here is a clinical inference.
Yeah, I think that's a great framing. And I'll say, at least from my thinking so far, this conversation is about what we might call the sort of lower level or NLP kind of inferences. If you wanted to take, and so just to be clear, for that, you can have multiple cardinality or repeating sources of evidence. So this extension can repeat. And if I saw 5 pieces of information across 5 documents, I could totally say my source of information for deriving this resource is this span, this span, this span, and this span from different places. And I think that's all fine. What you're driving at, though, is then sort of a more interesting, higher level question about reaching conclusions, clinical conclusions, or performing clinical reasoning based on, potentially more than just these NLP sources. It's not just I saw X and Y and therefore I reached a conclusion, but maybe I saw some data, I applied a model, I did some comparisons with other techniques. Like there may be many things that sort of roll up there. I don't think we're trying to model all of that kind of clinical reasoning activity and inference in this discussion. I think we're focused on pointing to low-level sources for the structured data that we extract from them. At least that's how I would scope it. But let me open up the conversation and see if others think that's aiming too low or generalizing the wrong way. I'm going to just capture that briefly in the notes. We're talking about low-level pointers from structured data back to sources, not about higher-level clinical reasoning type conclusions.
I suppose that my worry, sorry if I'm cutting anyone off, but no one's talking. I think my worry is that if there was only one sort of extension that allowed you to do anything like this, then if somebody wanted to do the higher order thing and they saw this extension, they'd use it for that purpose anyway.
I think it's a good point. So I think we should figure out how to take that side of the conversation forward. I do agree that we probably want something, but I don't necessarily want to overload either this conversation or this extension to meet those use cases. So let's definitely put this on our kind of follow-up list.
Yeah, and it might be a little mismatch or it might be a little heavy, but there is the evidence set of resources that might be useful for that. That if you want to say, this is the condition and this is my ML derived understanding based on this evidence, and then you can go and fill out all of your assertions and all that kind of thing to describe why you made that decision.
Good. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And so Gino called out the evidence resource. There's also risk assessment resources, or more generally just resources that capture assessments. So there might be a few different techniques that are worth exploring for those higher level clinical conclusions. And I agree, that'd be a great place for us to dig into. I'm not putting that on the follow-up list to squash discussion. I actually think we do need to dig in there. Okay, other comments or thoughts about the current state, so the examples that we talked through?
Sorry, I was just typing them in because I didn't want to derail just the random modeling questions. If it's been considered using ID instead of FHIR path, if that's easier, since any element can have an ID, and then instead of offset and length, using the range data type.
Yeah, so we have talked about these things. So the FHIR path the discussion only happened during our work group call, so it didn't get necessarily a lot of input. But one of the goals, so we went into that discussion having no way to refer to part of a resource. We just said, all we care about is referring to one text attachment on a document reference. We don't need a path. Feedback we got was, no, we do need ways to point out other pieces of a resource. Maybe it could be an XML or FHIR element ID. The challenge with that approach was, if you don't have control over the source, so if you have control over the source text, you could just take your span or your XML text source and just add an XML span around it and give it an ID. And you could say, great, I got this from this span. But if you can't edit the text source, you're stuck with what's there from the beginning. Similarly, with FHIR, identifying FHIR resource elements by ID, if you can modify the FHIR resource to point to the thing that you want to derive from, then sure, you can layer on an ID. But if that's sitting in a read-only server somewhere and you just want to refer to it from the outside and you can't modify it, then you can't rely on that ID being present on the element you need to reference. So that's why we actually went from an initial suggestion of element IDs towards these more general FHIR path expressions. For sure, that also brings its own complexity. So I don't know if this is a done deal, but that was the reasoning that went into that first choice. In terms of offset and length versus range, actually, Guy, I can't remember if we talked about this one directly. I think we may have early on. Do you remember?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was one of the early suggestions that used range, and I think the comments in the FHIR chat was that it's kind of abusing the range element.
I think that's right. And now that I look at range, range is an interesting data type. It technically could be pressed into service for this, but it talks about a low and a high, and their quantities, and so then you have to say, well, my low is a value quantity, and then you have to talk about what type of physical quantity we're dealing in here. So it adds complexity without, necessarily adding a lot of helpful semantics. Mostly just stuff to profile out. But I'm very interested in these modeling questions overall because, you know, the natural next questions for me here are, okay, how would we want to refer to things like a machine learning algorithm or model or engine that was applied? That was one that Dan and Ben both brought up, but I didn't hear the folks from Google, Microsoft, AWS bring this up specifically. What are thoughts about this? Is this something that's come up in the work that you've done up to this point, referring to models or versioned algorithms or something along these lines?
Sorry, Josh, to circle back on the text offset and length. I just want everyone's opinion on whether we need to put the actual text into this extension just to ease up the process so people don't need to refer to that file they probably don't have access to. Instead, all the text will be already exist in the extension.
Sorry, so the question was, let's say we're looking at this very first example here, condition. Rather than having a reference to a document, why not just put a value string right inside? Is that the question?
I mean, in addition to the offset and length, do we put the raw text in the extension as well?
So you might refer to the document where it came from, but also excerpt from the document, sort of belt and suspenders, do both.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear what folks think. My initial reaction here would be that it could be quite verbose, and if you don't have access to the source document, it's going to be very hard to evaluate that snippet in proper context anyway, but I'm interested to hear what others think.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this one. I plus one to what you said. I think that's one of the common feedback we receive is verbosity and how heavy the payload could be, and also how useful can it be. And to exactly what you said, right? Putting the snippet could take the entire derived NLP out of context as well, because something 3 sentences could have a completely different medical situation going on than if you only look at like 4 words or 1 sentence. So again, I think if you're already storing a file, I'm not sure if you need to store the snippet or not, just because you are not going to be able to recreate how you got to the place by just storing that. That's just sort of what I've seen so far.
Seems optional to me. Like it's not hard to just add it if you really wanted it. And you know, I'll echo the comments about payload size. It'll get very big very quickly, especially since, you know, presumably the, you know, like in most cases the text will literally just be the entity that you're identifying anyway. So the same text will appear in multiple places.
Yeah, I think on principle as well, I'm already sort of jumping ahead to some of the use cases for documenting spans in an image, for example. And then the same question would come up like, well, why not actually put the pixel data in line for that bounding box rather than just the coordinates? And that seems to me more obviously like folly. And so on principle, you know, I like the idea that we've got a pointer to a document and then, you know, a descriptor of where in that document this came from, and then have some clean separation there. But, you know, it's certainly easy for us to add more optional properties in this space for folks to sort of populate when they see fit. So I think we can certainly be open to that. Are there other thoughts on that point, or thoughts about referring back to the models or algorithms that are used for these derivations? Does anyone do this today in their existing outputs to have some sort of traceability in terms of what specific algorithm was run over the data?
So to add some context, so we have 2 versions of CTAKE's NLP engine that we use. One is more like a slimmed down version to just pursue for the high efficiency. The other one is the one with much slower, but with full functionality. Their interpretation to the same sentence will be sometimes different because like the second one has more understanding of the entire sentence and try to derive the information from that text span. So that's why we add the versioning to so we were able to replicate the result and understand the same sentence differently.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's good call out that it's not just what algorithm was run or what tool was used, but it's also some pointer to the configuration there. And if I understood right, Ben, you're wrapping all of that information up with basically some kind of opaque pointer or like a version, and then leaving the semantics of that to be defined outside of the extensions. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the entire more detail need to be defined somewhere else, but the extension could include the versioning.
Okay. And City, I think you were coming off mute, please.
Yeah, I wanted to say versioning is an interesting conversation we have internally quite a bit because it's, again, quite important. We change NLP models often as well, but there's a different element to it. Sometimes we derive information not just based on entities or just NLP. It's also linking it to the different ontologies we have available. And as ontologies get updated quite often, semi-yearly, annually, one of the questions we keep thinking of, and we don't have a good answer yet, is how far back do you go to these ontologies like ICD-10 or SNOMED and things like that? Because something that was true with an ontology derived last year might have changed this year. So we, with these kind of conversations and versioning, I don't think we have a good answer yet. But yes, internally we do talk a lot about how to think about this situation and handle it. Not that we've figured out a good way yet, but just the problem space for us is bigger than algorithm, I would say.
Yeah, so it's an algorithm, it's configuration, it's all the input or the state of the world on which those algorithms run. Like you would need to basically be able to reproduce all of that in order to get consistent results out.
Yep.
And I'll say, like, I actually think that's a quite laudable design goal. Not always achievable, but to be able to capture enough of the state of the world to say we can rerun this and we're confident we're going to get the same outputs back when we, run against this config. But that config could be, many gigabytes. I'm just thinking about the size of inputs like the UMLS meta thesaurus that has mappings back and forth between different vocabularies. If that was one of the inputs to your config, hey, that's a big one. But well, I'll get off of this soapbox in 30 seconds, but I'll say, like, I look at some of the work that's happening in Linux package managers like Nix that takes kind of this approach to say, I'm going to describe the whole state of my world in an immutable store somewhere and then pull bits out of it and point to it later. And then, the hash of that whole state can be sort of my description of the universe. Those techniques are very powerful and very interesting. I don't think we're quite ready to dive into that world here yet, though. Is there low-hanging fruit, like being able to pass in some URI that takes you to a web page that has more information for somebody to learn about what was done? Like, is there some middle ground that would still be worthwhile, even if it's not going to give us full reproducibility?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thought, and I think it would be possible to get to that state for sure. Now that I think of it out loud. So yeah, you've given me something new to think about right now.
Leah, let me open up for a broader discussion here. We've got just a few minutes left to the hour. I have a feeling we'll want to do some follow-up.
Josh, maybe a question on the previous topic on kind of adding the text to the extension. Would you say that it's also possible to kind of use the resource narrative for that instead of duplicating it to the extension?
In terms of the derived resource narrative,
right?
I think it would be possible to use it in that way, but if we were going to set that as the expectation or the convention, that would prevent the use of that field for other purposes that would be kind of perfectly valid for it. So I think that would be like a pretty strong or pretty heavy-handed requirement because it would stop people from using that field in other ways.
related to versioning, when we mark up with the references for the derivation reference extension, should we have guidance to say that those should be versioned references? Just thinking you point to a document and then a new version of the document supersedes the old one, and now your ranges are all incorrect.
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is they can be versioned references. Anything can be. Some servers support versioning, some servers don't. I don't know that we would want to mandate it because some servers don't support versioning.
I wasn't saying mandate. I was saying even a should, if it's supported, kind of a thing to say.
Yeah, I think
about this.
It's a good practice. And even if you don't use versioning, you shouldn't change the text and expect the data to still work. I think that's fair. So, all right, we're gonna quickly run out of time. Let me just take the temperature of the room. Would folks like to follow up here sort of asynchronously on the FHIR chat and talk through some of these issues? Would folks like to do another synchronous call in a time slot like this? What do people think? All right, if nobody's clamoring for more synchronous time, I'm going to be lazy and push us towards chat.phir.org. If folks aren't signed up there, please do sign up, or let me know if you want some pointers in terms of where to get started there. Based on this conversation so far, I think there's a couple of tweaks that we might want to make to the models that we've got. One of which is an optional field that points to some configuration information with something that BIN identified that they're using in their own models. And I think we might want to explore what it would look like to annotate bounding boxes for two-dimensional image-based sources. Those are two follow-ups. Are there other follow-ups that folks want to add to the list? So I'm going to just capture these at the follow-up section at the bottom. 2D bounding boxes and pointing to config. All right, well, this is...
Do we want to follow up on evidence or...
So I've got that already. That's the first one I've got, list of follow-ups.
It helps to read.
No, I mean, I'm jumping around in the doc and typing in different places and not screen sharing. So, I'm keeping things interesting for everyone. So we've got those three on the list right now. I think this puts us in pretty good shape. I really appreciate the discussion. This is a complicated area. There's a lot we could do, and the trick is figuring out what are the things that we should do in the near term that will leave our options open as we keep learning more, but also drive towards consistency. So really appreciate the time and the discussion. Any other closing thoughts from folks on the line? All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you for organizing.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dash.
Thanks for organizing and hosting.
Take care, all.
Thanks. Cheers.